Hello YouTube, this is Marauders here, and this here is my ASUS ROG Ally. So it's a portable handheld, it's a handheld gaming PC, and it works pretty great. There's a lot of power packed into this into this nice portable form factor. But it's of course it's not it can't do miracles, so performance on like modern AAA games isn't going to be the greatest. So here we see that we have Helldivers 2 running on it, and you can see that right now the frame rate is basically 18 frames per second. So not very enjoyable, looks nice, but of course it's not very enjoyable to play at this frame rate. So modern games have this thing called upscaling. So you hear terms like FSR and DLSS, and Helldivers 2 is no different. So here I can come into the settings for Helldivers 2 and I can change this render scale. And let me just set it down to performance. So I'm not changing the display quality or anything, I'm just changing the render scale. So what it does now is that when you change this render scale, I think Helldivers 2 is using FSR 2 or 3. So when you change the render scale down to performance, what happens is that the game will render the image at a lower resolution than the display resolution, which is 1080. So let's say maybe it will render it at 720p, and then it will scale it up using a special algorithm so that the graphics don't look like a very muddled mess. So now, after I change the render scale to performance, you can see that I'm getting about 30 frames per second. So this is now much more better than just now. The main thing is that it is around 30, so at least you won't feel that it's jerking that much, and it's a great improvement. So with this render scale technology, games have definitely become much more playable on portable devices because you can get a higher frame rate without sacrificing much detail, even by going down to a lower resolution. In fact, if I set it to, I think there is an ultra performance in Helldivers. I'm going to set it down to ultra performance. Okay, so now you can see that the image does get a bit more muddier, but yeah, I got like 10 more frames from it. Yeah, so it's up to you to decide whether you want what kind of display quality you want. So I'm just gonna keep it at performance. So that's great to have render scaling, to have upsizing support in your game is really good, especially when you're using it on lower powered devices like the ROG Ally. So it's great when a game supports upscaling because you can get more performance out of the limited power of lower end machines. But what if the game doesn't support upscaling? So here we have Grand Blue Fantasy Relink, and if we go into the graphics here, I'm gonna run it at 1080p 60. Okay, we're gonna go with just I'm just gonna use high graphics quality, and we're just gonna go in to the game, and I'm just gonna run around this area here, which is quite dense with foliage. So you can see right now that the frame rate is around 25 frames per second. So I guess when I'm looking at the ground, it's higher, but when I look at the detail, you can see that it does slow down. So anything under 30 doesn't really feel that nice to play, and I see that it actually dipped down to 19, sub 20 just now already. And this game doesn't support FSR, so so what can we do about it? So first, let's just try running it at a lower resolution, which is always the best thing that you can do when you're trying to see if your game you can get more frames out of the game. And for reference, I'm actually running at 20 watts TDP right now on the ROG Ally. I'm not running at 15. So the problem with this game is that I have to quit out in order to do the resolution resizing, which is irritating. Okay, so I am going to go and change the graphics to 720p. I'm going to keep graphics quality at high. Okay. So because I'm running borderless window and because of how the game works, it's now running in a window on the desktop. So you might be asking, why don't you just use full screen? Well, this will segue to the solution that I'm showing later. So yes, at 720p, we can see that it is definitely running faster. Okay, we are getting like 30 frames in this area. Let's just look up and start running again. So we are definitely keeping at above 30, which makes it a bit more playable. So now the question is that, why didn't I just run it at full screen? 720p stretched out to 1080 at full screen, you start getting that soft effect. But because it would just be a simple resize, there's no real special rescaling algorithm. So that's where programs like Lossless Scaling comes in. So Lossless Scaling is basically a window resizing program, for the lack of a better term. So what it's done is that it will resize windows using special algorithms. You can either choose, maybe you can use AMD FSR, or you can use your own LS1 algorithm, and we can get that same resize up to from 720 to 1080 with some sharpness filtering, and it will just basically look nicer instead of just simply blowing it up from 720p to 1080. Let's just quickly go into it. We are just going to say, so I'm going to use scaling tab LS1. Since this is a 3D game, you can just test around for the other algorithms. I'm gonna use with the we'll use medium sharpness first. I'm gonna you press scale, a countdown starts, we focus back our game. 3, 2, 1. And there we go, the screen has become full screen. And we still get our 40 frames from running at 720, but it is now going through the lossless scaling program to resize it back up to full screen. So everything still looks, well, you can use a full screen on it, so it looks much more nicer than having it on a window, obviously. And then if we want to make the image sharper, if maybe it's still a bit too soft, we can either just switch out. I'm just gonna go full sharpness. So it's probably a bit hard to see. Just take a note at the line. So this is full sharpness, and we can go down to like lower sharpness. So then that's basically it. When you have a game that doesn't have built-in resolution upsizing, you can just use programs like lossless scaling to scale up the display so that you can run it at a lower resolution and scale it up. So, but a few things to keep in mind is that your game must be running in windowed or borderless windowed mode. So you cannot be running in full screen mode. The other thing that's on the ROG Ally especially is that you need to set your gamepad controller from auto to, so there's auto, desktop and gamepad. So because of how the way lossless scaling works, you might want to just change it to gamepad mode, to keep it on gamepad mode, so that you can still control your game correctly using the gamepad. And of course, it's not magic. there's some CPU cycles being used to do this, so using this would introduce a certain very small amount of input lag. So maybe this is not the solution to use for Valorant or anything, but for single player games or PvE games, it's a very nice feature to have. But that's not all that lossless scaling can do. It has one more neat trick up its sleeve. And if you've heard the term frame generation, what lossless scaling can do is that it can interpolate frames so that it can make your game look like it has a higher frame rate even though it's displaying at a lower frame rate. So even though we have 43 frames right now, which is pretty decent and works pretty well because, well, it's greater than 30. That's always like the minimum level that you want for an action game. But it would be great if we could get something close to 60. So there's a new technology now where they call it frame generation, and it comes with the latest NVIDIA cards, and AMD also has their own frame generation routine. So lossless scaling actually has a frame generation mode that can start interpolating frames so that your game can look smoother. And let's give it a try. So there are a few things that we need to get ready first before doing this. First of all, you need to make sure that your ROG Ally is running at 120 mode. So here my ROG Ally is running at 120 screen refresh rate. Okay, 1080p, 120Hz refresh rate. It will be running at that at default unless you switched it away anyway. Now, in the game itself, I am going to turn off VSync. Okay, I'm gonna turn off VSync. And this works best if the game itself can limit the frame rate, because the moment you turn off VSync, it will try to render as much frames as possible, and we don't want to give the CPU extra work, so it's always great if your game itself can have a frame rate limiter. So I'm gonna limit it at 60 right now. Okay, so now on the surface, nothing much has changed. We just switched off the VSync, and we are getting like 30 frames per second. Now I'm going to go back to lossless scaling. There's this frame generation here. I'm going to turn this on to LSFG, so that's frame generation. And I'm going to go back to the game. Now, it will be a bit harder for you to see from the camera, but I'm actually now running at 70 FPS. Okay, 60 to 70 FPS. So how you see this is that this huge number here, this number is the game's native frame per second. So this is 39. But you can see there's a smaller number here at the side. I hope I can zoom that in correctly. So there's a smaller number here at the side. See, that's 62. That is the frame rate counter for lossless scaling. So even though the game is rendering at 60 or at this number, the actual perceived frame rate is this smaller number here. So it's actually running at 60 frames. And when you look at it, you will see that it's smoother, which is kind of magical when you look at it. But it's not all magic, because remember that it's basically just using special techniques to generate the frames that aren't there. Now I'm gonna zoom in a bit closer. If you can see that, just take a look at the floor. You'll notice that there's shimmering and bubbling happening around the stairs when we move it. So that's because, again, it's just an algorithm generating frames. So when you have changes that you cannot anticipate, you get weird artifacts. But maybe you might not care about it because you're just playing it. Things just go by that much and you're not too bothered with it because generally you get a smoother image. And that's a really magical thing to have. Getting extra frames out of nothing at all. But again, this is not a free operation. We can see that now the GPU is actually running at 97% usage. And yeah, we probably don't have any much more capacity already. And of course, there will be some controller lag being introduced into the game. So depending on the game, you might not want that. But again, this is a great, we're talking about options, and this is a great option to have. Especially when your game doesn't support any sort of other upscaling technology and you just want to be able to get more frames out of your games. Okay, to illustrate that how useful frame generation can be in extreme cases. So here we have Dragon's Dogma 2. This game, it has a very high requirement on system requirements in order to work properly, and I am basically running this at, if you look at the quality right now, I am running it at I'm basically running at 720p. Okay, I've kept the frame rate to 30 FPS because I'm not doing anything better. It's basically low. Every other setting is basically low, and I'm just getting 18 frames per second in the town. And that's a well-known fact right now that Dragon's Dogma is just, it's definitely giving a lot of pain for low spec machines like this GPD Win Mini that I'm using right now. And it doesn't work well at all on the ROG Ally because they haven't updated the drivers there. So that's why I can't use the ROG Ally to show you as a sample. So right now you can see that, yep, the frame rate is very low. Okay, so now let's see what we can get with, what kind of performance we can get with Dragon's Dogma 2 by using lossless scaling on it. So first of all, as I mentioned, we need to set the display mode to borderless, because right now the display mode is in full screen, exclusive full screen, so lossless scaling doesn't work with full screen. We want to switch it to borderless full screen or window mode. So I'm going to change it to borderless full screen, and you can see that something weird happened to this display right now. This is because the GPD Win Mini, like a lot of small compact PCs, they are using a handphone display. So the native orientation is actually portrait. And the AMD drivers don't seem to work very well with it sometimes. Programs just don't like the weird resolution being reported to it. So we can use borderless window, but as I mentioned, we can just use window mode. So I'm going to switch it to window. So now you can see that it's in window mode, and I've turned off vertical synchronization, VSync. I'm limiting my frame rate to 30 because there's no chance in hell I'm getting more than 30 FPS out of this. And we'll go back in the game. So right now it is running at, it's still the same. We have sub 30 FPS and sometimes sub 20 FPS. It's really bad. Okay, it feels like a very, it feels like Dragon Dogma 1 where the frame rate just isn't up there. Okay, so let's bring in lossless scaling. So we will take note that the frame rate is 22 FPS now. So I'm gonna bring up lossless scaling. I'm gonna use LS1 to scale the image up to full screen. Okay, and I'm going to turn on frame generation. And we scale, and then come to the game title window, and boom, Okay, so it's full screen now, and magic. And you can see that there's a so what just happened. You can see that, as I said, the big number is the actual frame rate of the game, so it's 22 frames per second. But you can see that the generator frame rate is actually 40. And even if it's not quite clear to you through the camera, because the camera is only recording at 25 frames per second, it's definitely, you can see based on the animation, it is, your eyes where you can see that something funny is happening. It's not as slow as previously, but because there aren't that many frames to begin with, we are just doubling from 18 and 20. You can see a lot of artifacts when you're running around the environment, but you will feel that it is smoother, and it does give a better experience than when it was at 20 frames without frame generation. So the question is, do you want something like this where things just look a bit weird but smoother? Or if I just turn off frame generation, or would you prefer this? Okay, so once again, this is frame generation off, and we're gonna go turn on frame generation. And this is frame generation on. And the difference is really night and day. You will feel a very big difference when you go from like 19 frames per second to 30 frames per second. Okay, so in summary, lossless scaling is a very indispensable tool if you have portable gaming PCs like the ROG Ally and the GPD Mini and the Lenovo Legion Go and so on, because the ability to give upscaling to games that don't support it cannot be discounted. Because when you can, if for modern games, if these low-end systems cannot run them properly, running it at a lower resolution always gives you more performance. And what lossless scaling will give to a game that doesn't have built-in upscaling capabilities is that you can run it at a lower resolution and not sacrifice so much of the screen detail and quality when you scale it back up to 1080 to your full screen. So that's already a very good base functionality of lossless scaling. But then we have frame generation. Now, when I first heard about frame generation from what AMD and Nvidia said, they always mentioned that frame generation only works best when you have already 60 frames per second and then you're interpolating it to 120. So to me, I always felt that this wouldn't help much for games, for low-end PCs like the ROG Ally and so on, because being able to hit 60 FPS is already hard enough on these devices. But it wasn't until when I tried this frame generation with Dragon's Dogma 2 and it can get something from 18 frames per second to 30, and I saw that, hey, even with all the artifacts of the interpolation, I could probably live with that. I can probably live with that just for the fluidity in most of the display. And I was really surprised. And in this case, lossless scaling really is proving its price. And seriously, it's not an expensive program. And it's on Steam, so even you can buy it, you can try it out, and if you feel that it's not helping you much, you can just refund it within 2 hours since it's a Steam program anyway. And the other thing to point out is that because Lossless Scaling is just working on Windows, it doesn't just support Steam games. You can use Lossless Scaling on any game. You can use it on Steam games, you can use it on Xbox Game Pass games, you can use it on EA games. It's a really good tool. I highly recommend getting Lossless Scaling if you have a ROG Ally or Lenovo Legion Go or GPD Mini or any sort of, or if you game on any low-end system, it can really help you. Now, you will also hear, other than this Lossless Scaling, if you've been around the internet, you will know someone will tell you that there's another program called Magpie, which basically does more or less the same thing like Lossless Scaling, just that it doesn't do frame generation. But Magpie is free, and it can do upsizing just like Lossless Scaling, but it cannot do frame generation. But the thing about Magpie is that even on the website, I can't remember where it was shown last time, the developers' priorities for Magpie is not for performance, it's not for real-time game performance. So you can try it and see whether it works for you, but I do recommend Lossless Scaling instead. Okay, this is Marauders. I hope you all learned something today, and I will see you all in the next video.